which is the head. It's hard to tell them apart today and say. Sister is busy learning the shade. Brother just out and driving his way. It's hard to tell them apart today. Hey, hey.
The 1920s have long been identified as the Roaring Twenties, a time when the American populace was roaring with prosperity and materialism. Although true to some extent, not all individuals were touched by this supposed affluence, nor did all benefit. Instead, the decade following the war was also defined by a resurgence of nativism and corruption both in the government and in society. To combat such social change, many activists worked towards the betterment of society, initiating both the beginnings of a feminist movement and Prohibition.
The 1920s were a time period sandwiched between two great wars. They were characterized by nativism and fear of foreign nations. The 1920s are known for radical political movements. Americans felt great pride in their country, but at the same time they were afraid. The end of the war made many Americans turn against the previous international commitments and attempts at diplomacy with other nations of the world. The ongoing debate about the League of Nations was still in effect. American support for the League of Nations started to fade away. Many Americans felt fearful of foreign entanglements. The election of Warren G. Harding in 1920 brought about many changes in American politics. His election was claimed to be the return to normalcy. What is considered normal to Harding may not be considered normal to many Americans. Warren G. Harding was a pro-business leader. Government was heavily influenced by business once again, and regulation was decreased greatly. Andrew Mellon, the Treasury Secretary under Harding, decreased income taxes on wealthy Americans. Taxes were cut from 73% to 25%. This caused the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer. This is believed to have led to the Great Depression. One of the successes under Warren G. Harding's presidency was the passage of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, signed by 15 nations in 1928, renounced war as a means of national policy and essentially attempted to outlaw war. Another issue after the war was the debt. The Dawes Act was passed in 1924, provided loans to Germany to pay off the debt it owed to France and Britain. The main problem people had with Warren G. Harding was that he did not see the issues that were happening under his administration. The Teapot Dome scandal was the biggest hit to Harding's legacy. In 1922, Albert Fall leased the Teapot Dome fields to Harry Sinclair. He also leased the fields in Elk Hill. Fall was bribed and was sentenced to 1 year in prison and had to pay $100,000 in fines. The election of 1924 brought Calvin Coolidge into office. Coolidge was just as pro-business as Harding had been, and he did not believe in any regulation. A famous quote by him is, "The chief business of American people is business." Taxes were low and profits increased under Coolidge's administration. The auto business also helped America prosper during this decade. Coolidge was popular for restoring public confidence in the government after the scandals of Harding. He supported civil rights, and the KKK lost influence during his presidency. In 1928, when Calvin Coolidge decided not to run for another term, Herbert Hoover stepped up to the presidency. Hoover had previously served as a Secretary of Commerce and was easily elected into the presidency, and had won the most electoral votes than any previous president. The end of the decade and the beginning of Hoover's presidency was tainted by the collapse of the stock market. This event was known as the Great Depression, and would damage Hoover's administration forever, as him and his cabinet members could not find a way to solve this problem.
Throughout the 1920s, the United States experienced a different economical situation than in other previous decades. In the post-World War I era, the United States enjoyed a time period of economic prosperity, except for the farmers. Due to their involvement in this world war, America benefited from supplying warring nations with materials and necessities. They produced much of the weapons that were used, and this prepared them for their entrance into the war as well. However, with the conclusion of the war also came the end of America's interference and involvement in Europe. The nationalism surging through the nation helped to strengthen the isolationist mood. This national pride also contributed to a big boost in consumerism during the 1920s. Due to the prosperity to many people in the nation, consumers started to buy and enjoy the materialistic items in life. A major industry that flourished during this time was the automobile industry. Once a treasured item and affordable only to the wealthy, Henry Ford made cars cheap and a common purchase among many middle-class families. This industry also provided a whole new area in the workforce, in which employment rates flourished. This added to the widespread prosperity of the 1920s. Although the period experienced an increase in wealth during the 1920s, the late part of this decade proved to be the start of the most economically devastating in America's history. Progressing towards the end of the decade, a worldwide depression spread throughout. On October 29, 1929, there is a disastrous stock market crash that threw America into the long journey of poverty in the 1930s. This day is known as Black Tuesday, and 2 months after, $40 million had been lost. That was more than the cost of World War I to the United States. However, the stock market collapse was not the only factor that caused these rough times. Many actions during the Roaring Twenties had an effect that later hurt the nation. A big cause was the wealth distribution throughout the nation. Big businesses were getting wealthier, which meant the same rich owners were receiving money. This allowed for these people to keep money instead of spending it. Also, towards the latter part of the decade, industries began to slow down in lower ways, and this resulted in less consumerism. The isolationist mood of the 1920s came back to really harm the U.S. It increased the depression of the poverty-stricken world as well as the devastating effect of the Hawley-Smith tariff. The economical disaster occurred during Hoover's administration, and the political field during this time found it difficult to lessen economic troubles. Hoover believed in rugged individualism, and therefore his government programs were relatively small. The years of prosperity changed drastically to a decade full of extreme hardships for the American people.
Disillusioned by peace and shocked by war, America entered a period of social isolationism during the 1920s. They shunned out diplomatic relations with foreign nations and sought to keep the idea of nativism. The rise of nativism was brought by the communistic scare of Russia, also known as the Red Scare due to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Many of these accusations started from the number of immigrants and foreign religions entering American society after World War I. Many feared that there were numerous amounts of communists and anarchists within the population and government. This Red Scare resulted in a nationwide crusade of raids. Leader against the communist campaign was Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who accused many of being Reds. Over 6,000 people were put into prison and arrested. Although many of them were released shortly after, this only increased the fear of communism. These Palmer raids and strikes began to get out of control, one of which occurred on September 16, 1920 on Wall Street, when 100 pounds of dynamite exploded, killing over 40 people due to claims of communism. These raids soon came to an end in the 1920s, but the hysteria of communism still remained within the nation. Another event that contributed to the anti-communism was the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Anti-foreign and native beliefs reflected upon the Sacco and Vanzetti case of 1921. Nicola Sacco, a shoe factory worker, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, a fisher, were convicted of a Massachusetts paymaster's murder and his guard. The jury and judge were both prejudiced in some degree due to the fact that they were both Italian and anarchists. Liberals and radicals rallied for both to be prosecuted. The case continued for 6 long years until they were finally executed. Vanzetti was still claimed to be innocent. Guilty or not, the trial ended badly for both based upon communistic views. The Ku Klux Klan was an organization that dominated the South for quite some time. They resembled nativist views. They supported anti-foreign, anti-Catholic, anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-pacifist, anti-communist, anti-internationalism, anti-evolutionism, anti-bootlegger, anti-gambling, anti-adulterer, and anti-birth control. KKK was founded in 1915 by William J. Simmons, an ex-minister and promoter of fraternal groups. The Klan promoted white supremacy, and it was vastly similar to the beliefs of the Know Nothing movement in the middle 19th century. Consequently, its appeal was not sectional and aided after 1920 by the activities of professional promoters Elizabeth Tyler and Edward Clark. It spread rapidly throughout the North as well as in the South. It furnished an outlet for militant patriotism aroused by World War I and stressed fundamental religion. Professing itself non-politically, the Klan nevertheless controlled politics in many communities and elected state officials and a number of congressmen, but its power in the Midwest was broken during the late 1920s. Immigration reached a new height in the 1920s. A flood of immigrants made way into America for new opportunities and jobs. Americans could no longer endure the mass amount of immigrants the population contained. Congress temporarily fixed the issue with the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924. The Emergency Quota Act, which restricted immigration to 3%, but this was soon replaced by the Immigration Act, cutting quotas from 3% to 2%. The purpose was to freeze off America's racial compression, mainly from Europe. Immigration then trickled down, but marked an end of an era, ending opportunity, freedom, and ethnic diversity.
The vast economic expansion of the 1920s was likewise matched by immense social change. Women were a prime example of this as a rising feminist movement began to assert itself in the post-war decade. By the early 20th century, prominent activists had emerged from the feminine masses, and with them new organizations, the earliest among which was the National American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Carrie Chapman Catt. Emerging from the shadows of NASA was Alice Paul, a young woman who felt that the group was securing little change for women. Therefore, in 1916, she left and formed the National Women's Party. This party's objective was that of immediate action. Believing that Wilson and the Democratic Party were the ones responsible for the delaying of women's suffrage, members of the NWP had several petitions in front of the White House, greatly in an attempt to defame Wilson's policies. Suffragists would finally achieve their monumental victory with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. With it, a female's right to vote was now safeguarded, and for the first time, a woman could exercise her voice in matters that pertained to her. Even though women were now recognized in the Constitution, Alice did not feel that her job was done. Therefore, in 1923, she pushed for an Equal Rights Amendment that called for absolute equality. If passed, this would have made discrimination based on gender unlawful. Unfortunately, it would not be passed for several more decades. World War I likewise brought about a new identity for women. During the 4 years of this war, women had gained numerous firsts. They now had the ability to enlist in specified divisions of the armed forces, and they had been called upon to occupy the industrial jobs of those who were fighting. Once the war ended, however, a majority of these middle-aged women, especially those of the middle class, returned home to take care of their children. This process of restoring women to their glorified roles as homemaker was sustained by the passage of the Shepherd-Toner Maternity Act of 1921, which appropriated funds to educate females on raising families. The same could not be said about the feminine youth, however. Young women of the 1920s no longer harbored the modesty of their preceding generations. Flappers soon became a common term to describe this change in women, especially in the fast-developing cities. These young females presented society with a stark contrast to that of the motherly image that they had been associated with for centuries. In fact, teenage females typically were not concerned with starting a family. Several men had died overseas during the war, and they did not want to be tied down by commitment to husbands and children. Instead, these young adults openly flaunted their sexuality with numerous partners, a characteristic of their careless spirit. In response to this, as well as with the desire to postpone motherhood, Margaret Sanger founded the American Birth Control League in 1921. Such an organization gave women more rights in regards to their own bodies. Aside from this, flappers found other ways to rebel against the pre-1920s conformity. In doing so, they drank during Prohibition and wore scandalous clothing that was both loose and short. Wearing such garments made profane dances like the Charleston easier and more popular. Although the 20s would eventually end, one thing was apparent. Women were beginning to assert their place in society.
At the start of the 1920s, Americans were forced to fall subject to the experiment of Prohibition. Due to the lack of support by most Americans, especially those residing in eastern cities, the government failed to strongly enforce these laws, thus ultimately allowing the control of gangs and bootleggers to come into prominence, controlling the decade. As a result of the forceful and tireless work by the Women's Christian Temperance Union since the early 19th century, Prohibition was finally achieved. This group was instrumental in the enaction of the 18th Amendment, which completely eradicated the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcohol. Through Prohibition, these groups desired to achieve a lower rate of crime and corruption, the reduction of social problems, and an improvement of health in America. Fearing that alcohol tore apart families, a number of people, mostly women, rallied behind Prohibition until it was finally achieved in 1919. Unfortunately, with just a simple look, one can see that their ideas would not be achieved, and in fact, Prohibition made the times more corrupt. Although the police enforced a ban on alcohol, it was still widely available in the underground bars known as speakeasies. Also, due to the inability to purchase alcohol in America, large amounts of alcohol was smuggled from Canada by rum runners, often from the West Indies. This illegal transporting brought alcohol to America, where it was sold at incredibly inflated prices in these bars, thus making the Great Lakes a hot spot for gangs and bootleggers who wished to sell alcohol. Due to the government's lack of enforcing this amendment, much corruption ensued during this time. Since alcohol prices were so high, bribery of police was not uncommon and led to bootleggers gaining power during Prohibition. Because so many drank illegally, bootleggers and gangsters ended up making a lot of money and gaining power. Chicago, the city most synonymous with gang wars, was a site where almost 500 people lost their lives through gang-related fighting. Most well-known of the gangsters was Al Capone, who from 1925 to the early 30s gained millions of dollars through smuggling and bootlegging liquor. Therefore, although increasing bank savings and decreasing absences at work, the experiment of Prohibition was seen as a failure. Throughout the years, the aggression towards Prohibition increased until it was finally repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933 by Franklin D. Roosevelt.